been an unprecedented moment in Canadian politics, managing a global pandemic.
Enough is enough. Go home and stay home.
And an economic crisis.
It is an economic impact, the likes of which hasn't been seen in over 70 years on Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
Almost 4 months in, and Ottawa has unveiled billions of dollars in aid, sent the military into long-term care homes in Ontario and Quebec, and kept the border with the U.S. closed. The federal government adapting to a new political reality as Canadians face their own new normal. So how has Ottawa handled the crisis so far, and what are the political lessons all governments can learn? Time for a check-in with the At Issue panel, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. I understand it's hard at this stage still to do a look back, but I do want to try and assess how the government has responded to some really unprecedented times, and I think we would all agree it's kind of incredible that all of this has happened in such a short period of time. So let's start with how they responded to sort of the public health portion of this, without you getting into health policy, but the realization from public health officials and then the government's execution of the fact that certain things had to happen. The border had to close. People were going to have to stop moving around. They were going to have to stay home and work from home. How would you evaluate, maybe I'll start with you, Andrew, how would you evaluate how the government responded to having to do that, having to force the population back into their homes, essentially?
I suppose you have to decide what your criterion is. I suppose if you compare it to other countries, for starters, not particularly well, middle of the pack, better than some, a lot worse than some others. Easy to say in hindsight, but when you look at it, they were warned repeatedly beforehand, as were the predecessor government, so there was a failure to plan adequately for it. When it did hit, there was at best mixed messaging and at worst complacency in terms of some of the messaging that was put out to the public in the first weeks of the issue, where they were told the risk level was low, when they were slow to bring in the controls on the borders, when they were slow to get their story straight on masks, et cetera. So in fairness, lots of other countries had made the same mistakes, had the same problems. They're not unique in that. No. But if you were looking, as I say, at some of the other countries' performance, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, they've done significantly better than we did.
Well, I guess one of the questions you could ask here, Chantal, is what kind of leeway do you give a government in making those decisions when it's something that is unprecedented, that no one has experienced?
And the fact is that governments do tend to fall back on previous experience. And when they looked for that book that tells you what you're supposed to do, it didn't exist. They're basically writing it as they go along. To give you a sense of the politics or the political mindset around this, remember that we went from a plane that had dozens, hundreds of Canadian passengers being downed by a missile, to railroad blockades, to this, over a very short period, in the life of a minority government that got re-elected last fall. Now, on the day that the World Health Organization finally declared a pandemic, the opposition, the official opposition, the conservative opposition, was busy pursuing SNC-Lavalin. So it's not as if the government was getting any pressure from the opposition parties who were saying, gee, guys, you're asleep at the switch. Beyond that, I don't know what you do when you are suddenly faced with the kinds of decisions that had to be taken. I would say overall that the only way to describe what the government did, which was by no means perfect or even great, was the best they thought they could.
Yeah. I mean, I think the government would even agree with that, Althea, that their response was not perfect, that they were, throwing stuff at the wall to see what would stick.
Yeah, I would say there's kind of like two different phases to the initial response. I think that they were ill prepared. And by they, I don't just mean like the people around the prime minister. I mean, the bureaucracy was ill prepared. When you look at Dr. Tam's testimony in January at the Health Committee, I think it was, she basically tells questioners, including Liberal MPs, that, there's no need to close the border and there's no need for quarantine. And that's not the way epidemics work. And basically suggesting that they don't know what they're talking about. And I do think that the government thought that it was overreacting which when it, urged for Parliament to shut down, and with the World Health Organization came and said this was a global pandemic. Whereas, in fact, the WHO was several weeks late in declaring that there was a pandemic. And so I think officials along the way, the information by which they were making decisions was faulty. Now, when they started responding to the crisis in terms of calming the population, encouraging people to stay home, to social distance, working with the opposition parties to come up with fiscal plans to give people direct supports to stay home, I actually think that part was a lot better. Prime Minister is a decent communicator outside of his home, still nearly daily. That was very good. I think people really did listen, and we have perhaps more respect for authority here when you see what's going on in the United States, for example. But I do think there was that we're all in this together. That did work. Yeah. And I do think that they actually worked with the opposition parties, at least behind the scenes, quite successfully.
I will say, when I talked to Dr. Tam about that issue of closing the border, the answer was so interesting to me. And the answer was that no one contemplated that was even ever an option. And so that certainly shows that we were dealing with unprecedented times. Let's just turn to the economic response, if we can, just because that too has been unprecedented. And it's hard to know how we're now going to get out of these things and scale them back. But Andrew, in terms of what they did to support businesses, the economy, Canadians, what do you make of that?
I just want to say very quickly, it wasn't entirely unprecedented. We did have the SARS dry run, and we were warned that we're going to be further pandemics to come. I think they did the best they could there. They had to. Everyone, I think, should cut them some slack on that. They had to come up with programs on the fly, on a massive scale, having shut down the economy. That certainly is unprecedented in living memory. Certainly, the notion that to get the money out the door to individuals and to businesses. There were design flaws, as we saw with the CERB, in terms of the work incentives, in terms of the openness to fraud. And we've seen that the wage subsidy program has really not been taken up in the way that the government might have liked. Business says because they were so slow rolling it out. Those, I think, are more in the nature of the kind of errors or omissions that are going to be forgivable and understandable in the context they were in, where they had to design this and implement it on the fly.
Chantal?
I think one of the reasons that the phasing out looks so difficult is it's not clear how much political and civil service energy you should put on phasing out when you don't know what the fall will be like.
Yeah, true.
Sure. And yes, I don't think that we can go for another entire shutdown in the way that we have seen. I don't think we can sustain it in any way, shape, or form. But that doesn't mean that life is going back to normal anytime soon. So that kind of makes it difficult to go through the process of shutting down programs when you don't really know whether it's too early. And every decision at this point is based on whether it's too early. I just want to say one thing about how Canada's handled it versus the United States, for instance. And that means credit not just to the federal government, but to the provinces. The last thing Canadians needed was for the premiers and the prime minister to start haggling in public. And they did a good job of avoiding to do that.
That is true. Okay, last word on this to you, Althea.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there are still going to be questions that are going to be asked and that deserve to be asked. And Finance Minister Bill Morneau has yet to provide a good answer as to why the government's first response was not to send blanket CRB checks to everybody and to claw them back on income tax, something that you heard being called for on the left and on the right side of the political spectrum. And while they did try to, as they argued, help the most people with the most money, there are still people that have fallen through the cracks. There are people that were unable to get financial help when they needed it, who will have lost their jobs and lost their businesses. And I don't think that we have an adequate picture of the damage yet that has happened over the last few months. I think just going back to work is going to be a challenge, as we're seeing with some of the proposals coming from the provinces, including the Conservative Party, the last week of June, suggesting, help for people so there's not as disincentive to go back to work and to be more productive. And so that will continue to be a challenge going into the fall for sure.
this pandemic has been an unprecedented challenge for our country, it has also been an important opportunity to figure out what really matters in our communities, to have meaningful conversations about how we can take care of those around us, and perhaps, above all, to think about what kind of future we want to build together.
Prime Minister has continued to face questions about what the upcoming months will look like, but how does the federal government plan for such an uncertain time? What are some of the big political challenges that lie ahead? Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj join me now for another round here. So obviously, as we said earlier, we don't know if there's going to be a second wave. We don't know what kind of response that's going to require. But what do you think is the biggest challenge that has emerged from this? Because certainly, we know that there are some big ones. They've revealed weaknesses and broken down systems and things that are going to have to be fixed, even after this is all over. Chantal, why don't you start?
Well, take healthcare and long-term care being identified as a major flaw. You can already see a tug of war coming between the federal government and the provinces over how you improve the system and what role the federal government should have in setting standards. That's going to be a money talk. And a money talk at a time when no government, especially not in the province, has a lot of money to spare. So expect those discussions about who's paying for what and fiscal federalism to heat up. Next question. This government was elected by making serious promises, you could say again, on climate change and meeting those targets. Do voters still feel that is a priority? Will the government still feel that it should be a priority? Or will we go back to the 2008 scenario, or after, in tough economic times, the environment falls by the wayside? There are hosts of questions and consequences on the government agenda that go beyond balancing the books and getting us back to some fiscal situation that is better than the one we are in today.
For sure. Althea, same question to you.
I think long-term care is absolutely going to be an issue that the federal and provincial governments are going to be squabbling over. And to Chantal's point, the money talks bit. The other one, paid sick leave. You know, a lot of workers in this country, more than half of employees, according to Statistics Canada, don't have paid sick leave. More people actually have paid vacations than they have paid sick leave. And that is also a discussion that actually many provinces don't want to have. So is that something that Justin Trudeau is going to be able to force on the agenda? Actually, on the climate thing, the government is so squarely on the left side of the political spectrum and trying to eat the NDP's lunch that I think it almost now has the political will to do things that perhaps it didn't at the beginning of this mandate. Pharmacare, a tougher stance on the environment, moving in areas of provincial jurisdiction where it feels like the public is behind them, even if the provinces may not be.
Andrew, same to you. What do you think is the biggest challenge to come out of all of this? I know there are many, but one or two.
Well, I agree. There's a number of challenges that have been already talked about beyond public finances. But if we don't have a sound system of public finances, and beyond that, a functioning economy, a functioning currency, then we're not going to be able to do any of them. And we are in dire straits now fiscally. We were already in trouble before this because of the aging of the population, particularly the implications for the provinces. But we're looking at a deficit of $300 billion or so this year, probably $100 billion a year or two after that. This has extraordinary implications for our future as a country, and particularly since so much of that has basically been bought by the Bank of Canada. So there has to, at some point, to be rolled out a plan that where businesses and investors and everybody else can look at that and say, okay, there's a plan now to get back to something approaching fiscal sanity. There's a plan to start to draw back some of those Bank of Canada purchases so we don't get an inflationary blow off out of these. And if that sounds dry or a green eye shade type of talk, if we don't do that, we won't be able to afford any of the other stuff to do with healthcare or climate change or anything else.
We like dry sometimes from you, Andrew. That's good. Okay, I got to leave it there. Thank you all very much for that. Appreciate it. Before we go, make sure you subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, in case you like to hear us more than look at us. Look for any major podcast app and our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.